Hello, fellow teachers, and welcome to Teachers School at the Accent Channel. Every month or so, I like to share some lessons that I've learned through my private sessions that I do with my students. I see about 20 students per week, and my students are split about half and half between actors who need to learn the American accent or another dialect, and non-native speakers who want to improve their spoken English. Now, I'm going to say something that I say all the time before we actually jump into the lessons that I've learned. I say this all the time to new speech pathologists or English teachers who are just starting to add the skill of accent modification or English pronunciation to their offerings. But this is such a huge myth, and I hear it all the time, so I'm going to say it again, and you'll know why in a minute. But here's what you need to know. You don't need to know everything about accents and dialects and pronunciation to start teaching, because you are going to get better with experience, and that is absolutely the truth. Even after 20 plus years, I'm still getting better and better with experience. I learned something new from my students in almost every session. And that's what this episode is all about. So I want to share a few really common mistakes that I hear frequently in my sessions with my students. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jessica, and I'm a speech pathologist who specializes in teaching accents, dialects, and English pronunciation. Here at Teachers School at the Accent Channel, I help accent and pronunciation instructors and coaches sharpen their teaching skills, find their own students, and create their own materials so they don't have to work for someone else. And when you don't have to work for someone else, you can build your own accent and pronunciation training business. And believe me, it's a lot of fun. It's a great new stream of revenue for English teachers, ESL teachers, speech pathologists, and other language professionals. So let's jump into today's lesson. Now I'm going to give you 3 common mistakes that I hear, and these are in no particular order, just in case you were wondering. But these common mistakes are great things for you to bring up in your sessions. You can point them out when you hear them, or even if you haven't heard your student do this, bringing this up during the conversational part of your session is a great way to show your expertise. Because these are mistakes that a lot of non-native speakers make, because let's face it, English is a tricky language to pronounce, but because a lot of people are doing this, when you bring up these mistakes before your students have made them, it really impresses them. People always think I can read their minds, or I'm such an expert that I know what they're going to do next. And I guess that is kind of the case, but the truth is I've seen it before. So if you're in a session and you're doing the conversational portion and it feels appropriate to bring up one of these examples, I think it's a great thing to do because it really will make you look like an expert, and that's what will keep your students coming back again and again. So the first common mistake that I want to take a look at is this one, the difference in pronunciation between Kansas and Arkansas. And this one makes perfect sense to me. Non-native speakers look at these 2 words. Usually they know how to pronounce Kansas. I don't know why. Maybe they've heard it more. And then they'll look at this second word and say Arkansas. And I've had students who have been saying it that way for years instead of saying Arkansas. So by bringing this up, bringing it to their attention and correcting it, if you can correct this mistake before they actually make it in a conversation, they will be so appreciative because it's embarrassing. I mean, it's not a huge mistake. If someone says Arkansas, clearly the listener is going to know what they meant. But it's still embarrassing. It still brings it to the listener's attention that the speaker is not a native speaker, that English is their second language. And these are all things that make our students feel anxious or self-conscious. So if you can get this one out of the way before they've made it, even better. So this is a great common mistake to work on with your student, the difference between Kansas and Arkansas. And be sure to point out to them as well that the S, this middle S in Kansas, is actually pronounced as a Z. And have them use the word Arkansas to really work on rhythm. That's a great word to practice the stressed syllable or the strongest syllable. Arkansas, because as they are stressing the first syllable, the R, they're really rushing through the can is turning into kun. It's being reduced a lot. Arkansas, that's not what we're saying. Arkansas. Arkansas, do you hear that rhythm? So 2 nice issues to work on, or 2 nice concepts to bring up as you're presenting this. Practice turning the S into a Z in Kansas, and really practice syllable stress on the word Arkansas. Okay, moving right along to common mistake number 2, pronouncing any and many. The letter A, remember sounds and letters are not the same thing in English. The letter A is really tricky in English because it represents more than one sound. It can be pronounced, or it can be representing A, like in the word same. The letter A can represent the ah sound, as in father. The letter A can represent the ah sound, as in apple, and those are just some of the possibilities. The example that we're looking at is more the exception than the rule. So this doesn't happen very often. The letter A does not usually represent the sound eh, as in bed. But in these 2 really common words, it does. So most non-native speakers will use the ah sound in these words. So they will look at these 2 words and read them as Annie and Manny. They will pronounce the letter A as an ah sound. And because these are such common words, and because using the vowel ah instead of the vowel eh, which is the vowel that we want, any and many, because using ah instead and saying Annie and Manny will actually turn these words into different words, I would take the time to really teach this and have the student practice until the new American pronunciation of these words becomes a habit. Again, in a conversation with some context, the listener probably understands that they mean to say any and many instead of Annie and Manny. But if you can help your student avoid making this mistake before it happens, although I imagine that they're already doing it, they will be so grateful. They will see you as the expert that you are. So another great common mistake to bring up with your students, make sure they're not saying Annie and Manny when they mean to say any and many. Okay, mistake number 3. This one isn't really a mistake. This is just something interesting that happened to me in a recent session. A student asked me if ain't was a word. And let me tell you the story so that it give you some context as to why. Because I think we can all agree that ain't is not a word. Ain't's not a word. We would never teach our students to use that word. I do teach slang and idioms, but ain't is not really considered slang or an idiom. I mean, I guess it's slang, but I wouldn't teach a student to use the word ain't. But here's what happened. I was doing the conversational part of the session with my students, and I get very close to my students. We develop friendships. I see some of them for years and years, so I get very comfortable with them. And the goal for most of my non-native speakers is not to sound like a broadcaster or someone presenting, someone doing an important presentation or giving a speech. Most people want to sound like a real person. And one of the best ways that I can help them is to make sure that I'm speaking like a real person during our sessions. So we're doing our conversational practice, and my student says something like this. He said, I saw that the Super Bowl is happening this weekend. Are you going to watch? He kind of asked if I was going to watch, and it was something like that. I saw that the Super Bowl is happening this weekend. Are you going to watch? And I responded with, because I'm not a sports fan, he knew that, so I knew it was sort of a joke. I responded with, well, it's happening, but I ain't gonna watch. And that's something I would say in a real conversation with that tone. It's kind of a joking way. He was joking with me. I knew that because he knew I didn't like sports. And my response to, I saw that the Super Bowl is happening this weekend. Are you going to watch? Well, it's happening, but I ain't gonna be watching. In that moment, I didn't even think about it, but then his question was, wait a minute, what did you just say? And I said, okay, what did I just say? And his question was, is ain't a word? I thought it wasn't a word. So I explained it. Honestly, I'm glad it happened because that is something I would say to a friend in a conversation. So I'm glad that this example came up. So what I explained to him was that ain't is not a word. It is not a word that I would recommend using in a conversational way. I mean, it's slang. I definitely wouldn't try to use the word, but occasionally people do use that word in a sort of a humorous way. And if you feel comfortable trying to use it, we can practice. We can practice the intonation. You could hear when I said, I ain't going to be watching. I didn't pronounce the T. I really ran it all together. I didn't say something like, well, no, it is happening, but I ain't going to be watching the Super Bowl. It was definitely delivered in a humorous way with the intonation and the connection and the rhythm that went along with that. So I thought it was an interesting example. And whether or not, I'm not telling you to teach your students to say ain't. I'm not teaching you to teach your students to use humor that they're not comfortable with. And I'm not teaching you to, although I do teach my students to tell jokes. We work on humor because there is a specific kind of pausing, intonation, as I said, connection and rhythm when you're saying something that's funny. But I think it's a great thing to bring up to our students because they'll hear it other places. And they could possibly think, if he had not been in a session with me, if I were just a person that this student were talking to on the street, I have pretty good speech. People like the way I sound. I sound professional most of the time, not always. But when you hear a professional person or someone who's teaching you use the word, you think that it's okay to use. And it is okay to use in specific situations. So this is just one of many words that maybe I wouldn't use if I were in teacher mode. I wouldn't put it on a list of vocabulary words unless maybe it was a vocabulary of slang. But these are things that our students are going to encounter in their real life conversations. So again, if we can help them understand when to use these words appropriately, we can then help them to avoid embarrassment, avoid saying something offensive, avoid standing out in a social situation. And this helps them feel confident about speaking English. And at the end of the day, that is why we do what we do. So I hope you learned a little bit. I hope you enjoyed these examples. I just want to quickly recap them. The 3 common mistakes, well, the last one isn't very common. That just happened recently, and it's only happened once. But I learned from it, and I'm going to use that experience. I'm going to use that situation. I have used it in other sessions with my students. I'm using it as a teaching point. So I hope you can too. But 3 common mistakes that you may want to consider bringing up with your students. The difference between Kansas and Arkansas. Making sure that they are pronouncing any and many with the as in bed vowel rather than Annie and Manny, the a as in apple vowel. And is ain't a word. You can come up with your own answer and maybe your own little lesson on ain't when it is, if it's okay. And if you want to just say, you could just say, no, it's not a word. Don't use it. Don't try to use it. I might do that with a student who I didn't know quite as well and who wasn't as advanced as this student was, but definitely something that you may encounter in your sessions. For many of my students, I know that I'm their guide to American culture. I help them understand what words are appropriate to use in a particular situation, and I help them avoid words that are not appropriate. I've taught my students what to say to ask someone out on a date, and then how to pronounce all the words on the menu where they were taking the date so they would feel confident and they wouldn't feel self-conscious about ordering on that date. I've taught students how to say no politely, what to say to a friend at a funeral. It's just so much more than pronunciation and accents. It's and even spoken English. always remember, and this is the point of all of this, always remember that things that seem very simple and are just common sense to us, those are the things that our students want from us, that they want to learn from us, that they need from us. So think about that. Always be listening for that. Do what you can to help your students avoid embarrassment, avoid making mistakes, and help them to feel confident when they speak. So I hope you got a few new ideas for your sessions from this episode. And if you want to learn more about teaching accents and pronunciation, about how to structure a session, how to create a 12-week program, and the most common goals that I set for students, I have a great new on-demand workshop. It's called Intro to Teaching Accents and Pronunciation. And in it, I go over everything that you need to get started teaching. So if you're interested in becoming an accent or pronunciation instructor or coach, and you want to be in charge of your teaching, of your business, of your schedule, and have your own students and your own materials, this is your next step. It is a 45-minute workshop, and it's packed with information and techniques and strategies that you can use immediately to start working with your students. Just go to theaccentchannel.com/teacher training courses to learn more about this workshop and the other courses that I offer. And I will also post that link to the workshop and the other courses in the lesson notes for this episode. You can also join me in our free Facebook group for accent and pronunciation teachers, and I will post that link in the lesson notes as well. Thank you so much for joining me here for Teacher's School at the Accent Channel. I look forward to seeing you again. Have a wonderful week.